A veteran spotted a sign advertising a German Shepherd for $10, and what followed gave a home to two lost souls. What could make a simple sign lead to a moment that changes two lives forever? Why would a small decision become something so meaningful? Welcome to our channel, where every story carries a message of hope, kindness, and connection. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our heartfelt stories. Thank you for being here and supporting this journey with us. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Now let us begin the story. Sometimes, the smallest price tag hides the biggest story. Ethan Walker never expected a simple roadside sign to change the direction of his life. It is a cold morning in Colorado when the veteran slows his truck and notices a handwritten message near a small animal shelter. German Shepherd, $10. For most people, it might look like an ordinary adoption offer. But Ethan sees something else behind the fence. He sees a pair of eyes that seem to understand what it means to be left behind. After years of keeping his world quiet and controlled, Ethan finds himself stopping for a dog he never planned to meet. He does not know it yet, but this moment will become more than an adoption. It will become a journey about trust, healing, and two lost souls finding their way home. Welcome to our channel, where every story reminds us that kindness can change a life. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a heartfelt story. Thank you for joining us. Now let us begin the story. The shelter was quieter than usual that afternoon. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallway, mixed with the soft hum of old heating vents and the gentle movement of dogs resting in their kennels. Ethan Walker stood outside the German Shepherd's enclosure, holding a small cup of coffee that had already gone cold. He had planned to stay for only a few minutes, just long enough to look, just long enough to understand why he had stopped that morning. But Bear was different from the moment they met. The shepherd did not jump against the gate. He did not demand attention. He simply watched Ethan with calm, careful eyes, as if he was waiting to discover whether this stranger would leave like everyone else. Megan Brooks, the shelter manager, walked beside him and noticed the silence between them. Most people ask why he costs only $10, she said softly. But the better question is why he has been waiting so long. Ethan looked at Bear again. What happened to him? Megan took a slow breath before answering. She explained that Bear was not always a dog who stayed in the corner. There was a time when he had a purpose. He was trained, focused, and trusted. But life changed. Circumstances changed. And somehow, the German Shepherd who once had a job and a direction ended up searching for a place where he belonged. Ethan understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years following orders, waking up with a mission, and knowing exactly where he was needed. After leaving the military, the quiet felt heavier than he expected. His house was peaceful, but sometimes peaceful and empty felt almost the same. He does not trust quickly, Megan continued. He watches people before deciding if they are safe. Ethan nodded. He did the same thing. The comparison stayed in his mind. A few minutes passed without anyone speaking. Then Ethan slowly sat down near the kennel. He did not reach through the bars. He did not call Bear over. He simply sat there. The shelter continued moving around them. Doors opened. Papers were signed. Other dogs barked in the distance. But inside that small space, everything became still. Bear lowered his head slightly and took one step closer. Ethan noticed, but did not move. Another step. Then another. Finally, the German Shepherd stopped a few feet away and looked directly at him. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no sudden burst of emotion. Just a quiet decision from a dog who had spent a long time protecting his heart. Ethan whispered, "You are not broken, are you?" Bear tilted his head slightly. Megan watched from behind them with a small smile. She had seen many meetings between people and dogs. Some were instant. Some took weeks. But this one felt different. He needed someone patient, she said. Ethan looked at the dog. Maybe I needed that too. Before leaving, Ethan asked about the adoption process. Megan explained everything carefully. The application, the home visit, the responsibilities, the commitment. Ethan listened without making promises he was not ready to keep. He had learned that caring for someone meant more than having good intentions. It meant showing up every day. As he walked toward the exit, he glanced back one more time. Bear was still watching him. Not with sadness. Not with fear. Just waiting. Outside, the cold Colorado air touched Ethan's face as he walked to his truck. He sat behind the wheel and looked back at the shelter sign near the entrance. $10. A number that seemed so small. But maybe the value of a life was never written on a piece of paper. Maybe some things could only be understood after you stopped long enough to see them. For the first time in a long while, Ethan Walker found himself looking forward to going somewhere. It was a strange feeling for a man who had spent years learning not to expect anything. But every few days, his truck seemed to turn toward the shelter almost on its own. He told himself he was only checking on Bear. Nothing more. Yet deep down, he knew something had already changed. The quiet German shepherd who once stayed at the back of the kennel had become the reason Ethan kept coming back. On that morning, the shelter windows were covered with a thin layer of frost, and the early sunlight painted soft golden lines across the floor. Ethan walked inside carrying a small bag of treats, but he did not rush toward Bear. He remembered what Megan had told him. Trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. Bear watched him carefully from the corner of the room. His ears lifted slightly when Ethan entered, but the dog remained still. Months of uncertainty had taught Bear to observe before opening his heart. Ethan understood that silence. He had lived inside it himself. "Good morning, Bear," Ethan said quietly. "I just came to sit with you." Those simple words were enough. Ethan placed the treats near the kennel entrance and sat down several feet away. He looked through the shelter window at the snowy Colorado landscape outside. The world felt calm, almost frozen in time. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Then Ethan heard a soft sound. A small step across the floor. Bear was closer. Ethan looked down and smiled, but he stayed still. Another step. The German shepherd slowly approached the treats, then stopped and looked at Ethan again. It was as if Bear was asking a question without making a sound. "Can I trust you? Will you stay?" Ethan lowered his eyes and whispered, "I am not going anywhere." He did not know if Bear understood the words. Maybe he understood the feeling behind them. Over the next few visits, something beautiful began to happen. Bear started waiting near the front of his kennel when Ethan arrived. The dog who once watched every stranger with caution began recognizing one familiar face. Megan noticed the difference immediately. "I have worked here for years," she said one afternoon. "Some dogs choose people quickly. Some take their time. Bear is the kind who remembers everything." Ethan looked at the shepherd resting nearby. Maybe he just needed someone who understood waiting. Megan smiled because she knew Ethan was not only talking about Bear. The connection between them was becoming something neither of them expected. Ethan began imagining what life would look like with Bear at home. He pictured morning walks through quiet neighborhood streets, a companion sitting beside him during peaceful evenings, a reason to leave the house on days when staying inside felt easier. But he also knew love required commitment. Bear was not a temporary decision. He was a responsibility. Before Ethan left that day, Bear stood up and walked closer to the gate. The movement was small, but it carried a meaning that only Ethan seemed to notice. The dog who once waited for everyone to leave was now waiting for someone to return. Outside, the cold wind moved through the trees as Ethan walked back to his truck. He looked toward the shelter one more time. Behind the glass window, Bear was still watching him. Two lives had crossed paths by chance. But sometimes, the smallest moments are where something greater begins. And Ethan was starting to wonder if he had found a dog who needed a home, or if he had found a friend who knew he needed one too. The day Ethan Walker signed the adoption papers, he realized something important. Bringing Bear home was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a promise. A promise to stay, to be patient, and to create a place where a once uncertain German shepherd could finally feel safe. The small house at the edge of town had been quiet for years. The walls held memories, but they also held empty spaces. When Ethan opened the front door that afternoon, Bear stepped inside slowly, looking around as if he was entering a world he had never known before. The wooden floors made soft sounds beneath his paws. The sunlight moved across the living room, touching an old chair, a small table, and the corner where Ethan had already placed a new bed. Nothing in the room was expensive. Nothing was perfect. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like a home was being created. Ethan did not expect everything to change overnight. He knew trust was built through small moments. So he started with simple things. A morning walk around the neighborhood. A quiet meal. Sitting together during peaceful evenings. Some days, Bear followed him from room to room. Other days, the German shepherd simply rested nearby, watching Ethan with calm eyes. Those small actions meant more than words ever could. Megan from the shelter visited a week later to see how Bear was adjusting. She smiled when she saw the difference. "He looks lighter," she said. Ethan looked at Bear lying near the window. "I think he knows he belongs here." Megan nodded. Dogs remember the people who give them patience. Ethan understood that. He remembered moments in his own life when someone's patience had helped him continue forward. The connection between them grew quietly. There were no dramatic changes, no single moment where everything became perfect. Instead, there were hundreds of small choices. Ethan choosing to come home earlier because Bear was waiting. Bear choosing to sit closer because Ethan had never rushed him. A friendship forming one ordinary day at a time. One evening, while cleaning a small box of old belongings, Ethan found his military dog tag from years before. He held it in his hand and looked across the room at Bear. The German Shepherd lifted his head and watched him. Ethan walked over and placed the tag beside Bear's new collar for a moment. Two different stories, two different journeys, but somehow, both carried the same feeling of searching for a place to belong. "You know," Ethan whispered, "I think we both needed a second chance." Bear moved closer and rested beside him. It was a simple gesture, but Ethan felt the meaning behind it. The dog who once waited for someone to choose him was now choosing Ethan in return. As the weeks passed, neighbors began noticing the change too. The quiet veteran who rarely spoke was now seen walking through the neighborhood with a German Shepherd beside him. People stopped to say hello. Children smiled when they saw Bear. Slowly, the empty spaces around Ethan's life began to fill again. But even as things improved, Ethan knew Bear still carried memories from before. Healing was not about forgetting the past. It was about discovering that the future could be different. One cold evening, Ethan sat near the window while snow gently covered the ground outside. Bear rested beside him, peaceful and comfortable. The room that had once felt silent now carried the sound of breathing, movement, and companionship. Ethan looked down at the dog beside him and realized something he never expected. The $10 sign had not marked the value of a dog. It had marked the beginning of a friendship that neither of them knew they needed. And somewhere between a shelter, a simple decision, and two uncertain hearts, a home had finally been found. The first morning after the snow fell, Ethan Walker noticed something he had never expected. The house sounded different. Not louder, not busier, just different. For years, the only footsteps across the wooden floor had been his own. Now, the quiet rhythm of Bear moving from room to room filled the space with a feeling Ethan could not quite explain. It was the sound of another life becoming part of his. Bear was still learning. Some mornings, the German Shepherd stood near the doorway, watching the outside world carefully before stepping forward. Other days, he followed Ethan around the house as if making sure the veteran was still there. Ethan never rushed him. He understood that trust was not built through promises. It was built through consistency, through every morning walk, every meal placed gently on the floor, every evening spent sitting together without needing words. A few weeks into their new life, Ethan began noticing small changes. Bear no longer waited for Ethan to leave the room before relaxing. He started sleeping closer to the couch. He lifted his head when Ethan came home. And sometimes, when Ethan reached for his collar before a walk, Bear looked at him with a calmness that had not been there before. Megan visited again on a quiet Sunday afternoon. She stood near the front door and watched Bear walk toward Ethan without hesitation. "I barely recognize him," she said. Ethan smiled softly. "Neither do I." Megan looked around the house. The simple furniture, the clean floors, the small bed near the window where Bear rested in the sunlight. "You know what is interesting?" she said. "When people adopt dogs, they usually think they are giving the dog a new life. But sometimes the dog changes the person too." Ethan looked toward Bear and stayed silent. He knew she was right. Before Bear came into his life, Ethan had a routine, but he did not have much connection. He worked, he returned home, and he repeated the same quiet days. He had convinced himself that being alone was easier, but Bear had slowly shown him something different. A home was not defined by how quiet it was. It was defined by who shared the silence with you. That evening, Ethan took Bear for a walk through the neighborhood. The sky was painted with soft orange light as the sun disappeared behind the Colorado mountains. Neighbors waved as they passed. A few people stopped to meet Bear, and the German Shepherd calmly accepted their kindness. Ethan watched the change with a small smile. The dog who once stayed hidden was now discovering the world again. Later that night, Ethan found an old photograph from his military years. He placed it on the table beside a newer picture he had taken with Bear. Two different chapters of his life. One filled with duty. One filled with healing. He realized that both mattered. The past had shaped him, but it did not have to define him forever. Bear rested near his feet while Ethan looked at the two pictures. "Funny how things happen," he whispered. "I thought I was bringing you home." The German shepherd lifted his head. Ethan smiled. "Maybe you were bringing me back too." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, the house remained warm and peaceful. The journey was not finished. There were still memories to overcome and new moments waiting ahead. But for the first time in years, Ethan was not facing the future alone. And Bear, the dog once overlooked by so many, finally had something every soul deserves. A place where he was wanted. A place where he belonged. The winter days passed slowly, but something inside Ethan Walker's home had begun to change. It was not a dramatic transformation. There was no single moment when everything became perfect. Instead, it happened through small pieces of everyday life. A familiar sound at the door. A German shepherd waiting near the window. A quiet companion resting beside him during the evening hours. Bear was no longer just a dog living in Ethan's house. He was becoming part of Ethan's story. But one thing remained unfinished. Ethan still knew very little about the life Bear had before the shelter. He knew the German shepherd had once been trained and trusted. He knew something had changed, but he did not know the full story behind the eyes that watched him so carefully. One afternoon, Ethan visited Megan at Pine Ridge Animal Shelter. The old sign near the entrance had already been replaced, but Ethan still remembered the first time he saw Bear's name written beneath that simple offer. $10. A number that seemed almost impossible for a dog with so much intelligence and loyalty. "There is something I always wanted to ask," Ethan said. Megan looked up from her desk. "About Bear?" Ethan nodded. "What was his life like before this?" Megan became quiet for a moment. She opened a folder containing Bear's records. Inside were notes, photographs, and memories from another chapter of the German shepherd's life. Bear had once been a working dog with a clear purpose. He learned commands quickly. He stayed focused. He formed a strong connection with the people around him. But life does not always follow the path we expect. Changes happened. Circumstances shifted. And eventually, Bear found himself in need of a new beginning. The hardest part was not that he lost his routine, Megan explained. The hardest part was that he lost the feeling of knowing where he belonged. Ethan looked down at the folder. Those words stayed with him. He understood them. After leaving military service, he had also spent time searching for a new purpose. People often saw veterans as strong because they knew how to handle difficult moments. But sometimes, strength also meant admitting when something was missing. When Ethan returned home that evening, Bear immediately walked toward him. The German shepherd looked up as if asking how his day had been. Ethan sat on the floor beside him. "I think I understand you a little better now," he whispered. Bear rested his head near Ethan's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a message. The past mattered, but it did not have to decide the future. Over the next few weeks, Ethan began creating new traditions with Bear. Saturday morning walks through quiet trails. Visits to the local park. Small moments where Bear could experience new places without pressure. The German shepherd slowly became more confident. He began exploring instead of observing. He began approaching people instead of waiting for them to leave. One afternoon, Ethan noticed Bear standing near the front window, watching children playing outside with their families. The dog's expression was calm, peaceful. Ethan smiled because he realized something important. Bear was not just learning how to live in a new home. He was learning how to believe in one. Later that night, Ethan placed Bear's collar beside his old military belongings. The contrast was powerful. One represented a chapter filled with responsibility and service. The other represented a chapter filled with healing and companionship. Different memories, different seasons of life, but both carried the same reminder. Everyone deserves another chance. Everyone deserves a place where they can finally rest. As the snow continued falling outside, Ethan watched Bear sleeping comfortably beside the fireplace. The German shepherd who was once overlooked now had a family. And the veteran who once thought he had already found his path discovered that sometimes a new beginning arrives quietly. Sometimes it comes with 4 paws, a patient heart, and a friend who simply chooses to stay. The first signs of spring arrived quietly in Colorado. The snow began melting along the sidewalks, and the cold mornings slowly became softer. For Ethan Walker and Bear, life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every day carried small moments that once seemed impossible. A morning walk beneath a clear sky. A quiet breakfast shared beside the kitchen table. A German shepherd resting nearby, while Ethan read by the window. But something unexpected was about to remind Ethan that healing was never only about the past. Sometimes, it was about helping someone else find their way forward. One Saturday morning, Ethan and Bear visited a local community event where families gathered with their pets. Ethan almost decided not to go. Crowds had never been easy for him, and he wondered if Bear would feel overwhelmed. But the German shepherd surprised him. Instead of staying close behind, Bear walked beside him with confidence. His ears were relaxed. His steps were calm. It was a different dog from the one Ethan first saw hiding in the shelter. Near the edge of the event, Ethan noticed a young family struggling to understand their nervous rescue dog. The dog stayed close to its owner, unsure about the unfamiliar surroundings. Ethan recognized that expression immediately. He had seen it before. He had seen it in Bear. He gently shared a few words about patience and allowing trust to grow naturally. He did not try to fix everything. He simply offered understanding. Later that afternoon, Ethan realized something important. Bear had taught him more than how to care for a dog. He had taught him how to recognize quiet pain in others. The veteran who once believed he had nothing left to give was now someone people turned to for comfort. That evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Bear beside him. The mountains in the distance were covered with the last traces of snow, and the air carried the fresh scent of a changing season. "You know, Bear," Ethan said softly, "I think you helped me remember who I was." The German shepherd looked toward him, calm and steady. Ethan smiled because he understood something deeper. Bear did not need to speak to make a difference. His presence was enough. A few days later, Megan from the shelter called Ethan with a question. There was another dog at the shelter who reminded her of Bear when he first arrived. A dog who watched quietly. A dog who needed time. She wondered if Ethan would visit and share his experience. Ethan agreed without hesitation. When he arrived, the shelter felt different than before. The same walls. The same sounds. But Ethan was not the same person who first walked through those doors. Back then, he was searching for a reason to move forward. Now, he carried a lesson learned from a German shepherd who had once needed someone to believe in him. Ethan sat near the new dog's kennel and waited patiently. He did not force a connection. He simply offered a calm presence. After a while, the dog moved a little closer. Ethan smiled. It was a small moment, almost invisible to anyone who was not paying attention. But Ethan knew the value of small moments. They were where trust began. When Ethan returned home later, Bear greeted him at the door, as always. The German shepherd looked at him with familiar warmth, and Ethan felt grateful. Years ago, he thought he was giving a forgotten dog a second chance. Now he understood the truth. Sometimes, two souls find each other because both are searching for the same thing. A little patience, a little kindness, a place to belong. And sometimes, the greatest transformations begin with something as simple as opening a door and choosing not to walk away. The following months brought a quiet kind of happiness into Ethan Walker's life. Nothing about it was loud or dramatic. It was found in ordinary mornings, familiar routines, and the peaceful moments shared between a veteran and a German shepherd who had both learned what it meant to begin again. But Ethan soon discovered that even the strongest bonds are tested, not by great challenges, but by small moments that ask whether trust is truly there. One early morning, Ethan noticed something unusual. Bear was standing near the back door, looking outside at the open field behind the house. The German shepherd seemed focused, almost thoughtful. Ethan walked over and placed a hand gently on Bear's collar. "What are you thinking about?" he asked with a small smile. Bear turned toward him, then looked back outside. It reminded Ethan of the first day they met. Back then, Bear watched everything carefully because he did not know what would happen next. Now, he watched the world with curiosity instead of uncertainty. That difference meant everything. A few days later, Ethan decided to take Bear on a longer trail walk through the nearby mountains. It was a place where the air felt clean, the trees moved with the wind, and the noise of everyday life disappeared. Ethan had always found peace outdoors, but this time felt different. Bear walked beside him, not behind him. The German shepherd moved with confidence, stopping occasionally to explore new scents and sounds. Ethan watched him and realized how far they had both come. During their walk, Ethan met an older couple who noticed Bear's calm nature. They asked about him, and Ethan shared the story of the $10 adoption sign and the dog who had changed his life. The couple listened quietly. "Sometimes the ones who need saving end up saving us," the woman said. Ethan smiled because he knew exactly what she meant. That evening, Ethan returned home feeling grateful. But the next morning, he received a call from Megan at the shelter. She sounded concerned. A severe winter storm was expected to arrive, and the shelter needed volunteers to help prepare. Without hesitation, Ethan offered to assist. He packed supplies, loaded Bear into the truck, and drove toward the shelter where their journey had started. When they arrived, Bear immediately recognized the place. Ethan noticed something remarkable. The dog who once entered that shelter uncertain and alone now walked through the doors with calm confidence. He was not the same dog anymore. During the busy hours that followed, Ethan helped organize supplies and prepare comfortable spaces for the animals. Bear stayed nearby, quietly offering companionship to the nervous dogs around him. Megan watched the German shepherd carefully. "He is different," she said. Ethan looked over. Yes, he is. But he knew something else was different too. He was different. Years earlier, he might have walked away from situations that required emotional effort. He might have believed that keeping distance was easier. But Bear had shown him another way. Compassion was not a weakness. Patience was not wasted. Caring for another soul could also heal your own. When the storm finally passed, the shelter was peaceful again. Ethan stood outside with Bear beside him, watching the clouds move away and the sunlight return. He remembered the day he saw that simple sign. He thought he was making a small decision. He thought he was choosing a dog. But standing there now, he understood something deeper. Some choices choose us too. Bear had arrived in his life needing a home. Ethan had welcomed him with patience. But somewhere along the way, the German shepherd had given him something just as valuable. A reason to open his heart again. A reason to believe that new beginnings could happen at any age. And as Bear rested beside him under the clear Colorado sky, Ethan knew their story was no longer about being rescued. It was about finding each other. The seasons changed, but the bond between Ethan Walker and Bear remained the same. What started with a simple sign and a $10 decision had become something much greater than either of them expected. The German shepherd who once waited quietly for someone to notice him now walked through life with confidence. The veteran who once believed his quiet days would never change now had a companion who reminded him that every heart can begin again. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset disappear behind the Colorado mountains. Bear rested beside him, his head gently leaning against Ethan's leg. The moment was peaceful, but Ethan found himself thinking about the journey that brought them there. He remembered the shelter, the first meeting, the uncertainty in Bear's eyes, the question that had existed between them from the beginning. Would they choose each other? The answer had come slowly, through patience and trust. It had come through thousands of small moments that no one else saw. A morning walk, a quiet look, a familiar sound at the front door. The kind of moments that quietly build a lifetime. Months later, Ethan returned to Pine Ridge Animal Shelter with Bear. Megan was outside when they arrived, and her face immediately lit up. "Look at him," she said. "I remember the day he came here. I never imagined he would change this much." Ethan smiled as Bear walked around the familiar area with calm confidence. The shelter that once represented uncertainty now represented the beginning of something beautiful. Several people stopped to greet Bear. Some remembered him. Others simply noticed the connection between the veteran and the German shepherd. Megan watched from a distance and said, "You know, when people saw that sign, they saw a $10 dog. They did not see what was inside him." Ethan looked down at Bear. "I think he was waiting for someone to see him." Megan nodded. "And I think you were waiting for the same thing." Those words stayed with Ethan. Because she was right. Bear had needed someone to believe in him. Ethan had needed a reason to open his heart again. Neither of them had been looking for the other that day. But somehow, they found exactly what they needed. Over time, their story became known throughout the community. Not because of the price on a sign. Not because of a dramatic moment. But because people saw something rare. They saw kindness creating a connection. They saw a reminder that every living being carries a story that others may never know. Ethan continued visiting the shelter and sharing his experience with people considering adoption. He never told them that every adoption would be easy. He simply told them that patience mattered. That trust took time. That sometimes the most meaningful relationships begin with the souls others overlook. One afternoon, Ethan and Bear walked the same trail where they had spent many quiet mornings together. The trees moved gently with the wind. The sunlight filtered through the branches. Bear walked beside him, exactly where he belonged. Ethan stopped for a moment and looked at his companion. "You know," he whispered, "I thought I was giving you a home." Bear looked up at him with peaceful eyes. Ethan smiled. "But you gave me one too." The world around them remained quiet. No grand announcement. No celebration. Just a veteran and a German shepherd standing together beneath the open sky. Two lives that had once felt incomplete had found something they never expected. Not perfection. Not a life without challenges. Something much more valuable. A place to belong. A reason to keep moving forward. And sometimes, that is the greatest miracle of all. Not finding someone who saves you, but finding someone who reminds you that you were worth saving all along.